Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, January 13th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. South Korea threatens that it might acquire nuclear weapons of its own. So this is pretty major. South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol on Wednesday said that South Korea could obtain its own nuclear weapons if threats from the North grow. And this makes the first such comments from a South Korean leader in decades. So Yoon said this at a policy briefing with his foreign and defense ministers. He said, quote, "It's possible that the problem gets worse and our country will introduce tactical nuclear weapons or build them on our own. If that's the case, we can have our own nuclear weapons pretty quickly, given our scientific and technological capabilities," end quote. So this warning from Yoon, it comes as tensions are really high on the Korean peninsula, and the prospect of the South obtaining nukes is going to inflame tensions even more. And according to the New York Times, Yoon's comments were the first time a South Korean leader officially mentioned arming the country with nuclear weapons since at least 1991, and that was when the U.S. withdrew its nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. used to have nukes stationed there. They pulled them out in 91. And Yoon said he could also ask, another option for him is to ask the US to redeploy those weapons. And he said that increasing military cooperation with the US was another way that he could deal with the growing threats from the North. So before Yoon came into office, when he was running, right after he was elected, him and his people close to him were saying that he was going to ask the US to redeploy its nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula. But he also said that acquiring nuclear weapons was not yet, an official government policy. That, no decision has been made in that regard. But his office, didn't walk back the comments. They clarified what he said the following day, and he said what he said. His office said on Thursday, quote, "The most important part of his comments yesterday was that a realistic measure at the moment is to effectively strengthen extended deterrence within the security alliance between South Korea and the United States. However, when it comes to security, the worst case scenario must always be taken into consideration." And from that perspective, he was making his commitment and determination ever clear to protect the people against these escalating threats from North Korea, end quote. So, as things are right now, South Korea is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that bans non-nuclear armed states from acquiring nuclear weapons. And Yoon's office said that Seoul still abides by the NPT, and it doesn't plan on making any changes to that. At least they haven't made a decision to do so. When they talk about extended deterrence, I think that's what Yoon wants is, either the US to redeploy its nuclear weapons back to South Korea, or as he mentioned earlier, he said he was in talks with the US about holding joint military exercises that involved US nuclear forces. So he wants some more of a guarantee from the US because South Korea is under the US nuclear umbrella, and they've threatened the North recently, say if you use nukes on the South, we're going to nuke you. They didn't even say nukes. They said they'll defend South Korea with all their weapons, including nuclear weapons. Um, and so, as things stand right now, North Korea launched a record number of missile tests in 2022 as the U.S. and South Korea resumed the massive war games. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he recently ordered his country to expand its nuclear arsenal. And Yoon, that's when Yoon said he was in talks with the U.S. on those exercises potentially with U.S. nuclear forces. And the Biden administration has made virtually no effort to diffuse tensions, and they seem to be giving Yoon what he wants. They've deployed bombers to the peninsula for the first time since 2017, since tensions eased after Trump, met with Kim. All those kind of tacit agreements that they made following those summits have all gone away since Biden came in, and tensions are really high again. And I mean, I don't think as things stand, I haven't seen an American comment on what the South Korean president said here. I looked at the State Department press briefing today. Nobody even asked about it. So, but I doubt the US is going to say, okay, yeah, you guys can get nukes, right now, but maybe in the future, I wouldn't be surprised. Or if they oblige this request to send their own nuclear weapons back there. And for the Americans, it's going to be kind of more about China, I think, if they do deploy nukes to South Korea, but they might do it anyway. I could see them doing something like that in the future. So tensions are just going to continue to escalate there. Okay, so the next article here is almost unbelievable. A House Republican introduced a resolution to place a bust of Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, at the Capitol building. So this was Rep. Joe Wilson. He's a Republican from South Carolina. And he introduced a bill this week that would order the Fine Arts Board to obtain a bust of the president of Ukraine for display in the House wing of the Capitol building. So they want to. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I don't even really know what to say about it. But a lot of Republicans, more conservative Republicans, they had a lot to say about it. They really blasted it, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican from Georgia. She posted a picture of the resolution on Twitter and said, absolutely not. We serve America, not Ukraine. Thomas Massey, Republican from Kentucky, he wrote on Twitter that he wanted to believe this resolution was satire. And he linked to an article from the conservative advocacy group Freedom Works that gave 5 reasons why to oppose the bust. And the 5 reasons that they gave were: 1, Ukraine is not the 51st U.S. state. 2, the U.S. doesn't own the conflict or is obligated to continue funding it. 3, further payments would encourage U.S. taxpayer-funded reconstruction of Ukraine. And I thought that was an interesting point because I think that is in our future, if is the U.S. paying for the reconstruction, or at least parts of it. 4, Ukraine is corrupt and this conflict is not about defending democracy. 5, zero oversight of taxpayer aid to Ukraine. Andy Biggs, he's a Republican from Arizona. He also, had things to say about the resolution, critical things to say. Now, while Zelensky, when he went to D.C., he mostly received a hero's welcome, and he was given many rounds of applause when he was addressing Congress. It looked like a State of the Union, but you had both sides standing up and applauding the whole time. But only 86 out of 213 House Republicans attended his speech, so less than half. But some of those absences could be explained by them getting an early start for Christmas travel because it was right before Christmas. But there is a small, but as I have gone over a lot, but I think significant opposition to arming Ukraine among Republicans. But for now, overall, GOP leadership is incredibly supportive of arming Ukraine, and they want to do more. They're critical of President Biden for not sending longer range weapons, more advanced weapons. They want to send fighter jets and tanks and things like that. But as this war drags on, I think the opposition among Republicans is going to grow, and hopefully some of the progressives that are usually good on war, who have been absolutely abysmal on Ukraine, start to kind of wake up a little bit, and maybe we'll see some opposition from them too. But I'm not holding my breath on that. And unfortunately, I mentioned some Republicans are against arming Ukraine because they think the U.S. should be flooding Taiwan with weapons. And Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, he really embodies that. He wrote a letter to Blinken saying, hey, all these weapons were sent into Ukraine. We should send them to Taiwan instead. But anyway, the next article here, the Navy Secretary says that arming both the U.S. and Ukraine may become challenging. So this is interesting. This is the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro. He said on Wednesday that it might become challenging for the U.S. military to continue arming itself as it continues to pour weapons into Ukraine, unless the arms industry can significantly boost production. So I think this really shows just how much the U.S., how many weapons they're sending over there. And for now, most of the weapons are used on land. They're not naval weapons, really, and they come from U.S. Army stockpiles Although the Pentagon, they did just say they're sending Sea Sparrow missiles, which are fired from ships. Um, but Del Toro said that the Navy was still concerned about if the arms industry could meet its demands. He was responding to a question. He was at some conference responding to a journalist who asked if the Navy was at the point where it had to choose between arming itself or Ukraine. And he said, quote, "Yeah, that's always a concern for us, and we monitor that very, very closely. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet, but if the conflict does go on for another 6 months, for another year, it certainly continues to stress the supply chain in ways that are challenging," end quote. So the US, just in military equipment alone, they've pledged over 20 billion, I think maybe around 22 billion now, just in weapons that they're just shipping over there and buying for Ukraine. Um, and they've sent just an incredible amount of ammunition. I forget which kind of shell it is, artillery shell. They've sent over 1 million over there. And this policy, of course, is a boon for the arms industry. And, Del Toro and these officials that are saying that they have to worry about these things, they might just be trying to push this ramp up in weapons production to help out their buddies, at the defense contractors. But I think it does show how much, the U.S. is just pouring in there. And really, the most significant thing when it comes to ramping up the weapons production is the fact that the NDAA included what they have dubbed wartime purchasing powers for the Pentagon, which allows non competitive and multi year contracts, basically lifting restrictions, getting rid of red tape to speed up these arms deals. And that's going to make them end up probably paying more. It's less competitive, and it's for certain weapons, so that they're doing this, and they're mostly made by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and of course, Raytheon is the former employer of Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense. All right, the next article here: more tanks. There's been a lot of tank stories lately. Germany says that Poland can send Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Well, this is the German Vice Chancellor. Germany's vice chancellor said on Thursday that Berlin won't stand in the way of Poland sending German made Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. This is a move that would significantly escalate Western military aid for Kiev and risk provoking Moscow. So this is Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck. He said, quote, "There is a difference between making a decision for oneself and preventing the decision of others. And accordingly, Germany should not stand in the way when other countries make decisions to support Ukraine, regardless of what decision Germany makes," end quote. So Poland says that they're ready to send these Leopard 2 tanks, which are made by Germany. And because they bought them from Germany, I guess it's in the contract that if they transfer them to another country, it has to be signed off by Berlin. And it wasn't really clear if Germany was willing to do that, but it seems like they are. And Poland, their president, said that his government has decided to send about 14 of these Leopard 2 tanks. But it's still not clear if they formally made the request of Germany. Duda, the Polish president, said that he wants to do it as part of an international coalition. So he's likely waiting for other countries to get on board to send these Western made tanks. And the UK, the British, are also preparing to provide Ukraine with their main battle tank, the Challenger 2. Financial Times reported Thursday that British officials said that Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, has ordered his defense secretary to work with partners in the coming weeks to, increase support for Ukraine, including the provision of tanks. So it looks like a decision has been made by the British to send it over there. So whether the Challenger 2 or the Leopard 2 makes it to Ukraine, whichever one makes it to Ukraine first, is going to be the first Western-made tank, heavy armor provided to Kiev. Ukrainian officials are looking for a lot of these tanks. They said they need at least 300 if they want a chance of pushing Russia out. So 14 from Poland isn't going to do it. They're going to need to really pull together and send a lot to Ukraine. And right now, there's no sign that the U.S. is planning to send its main battle tank, the Abrams. And from what I understand it, they're prone to breaking down. They need like constant maintenance. They're pretty difficult to maintain, pretty much. And the Leopard 2 apparently is better for that purpose. But the White House did say that they support this decision by Britain and Poland, so they're on board. And let's remember what Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, said in September, and what I believe Pentagon officials, speaking anonymously to the media, have said earlier in the war. We're not going to send tanks because it really risks an escalation. We don't want to provoke Russia. Scholz said he's trying to avoid, a direct clash between Russia and NATO, World War III. But here we go again, more escalation. We just keep going down this road. Escalation, escalation, and there's no end in sight to this policy. I just want to take this moment to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. Just to remind you, if you can help out, please donate. This is how we get by. We're entirely reliant on our readers. We couldn't do this kind of content any other way, really. We don't get grants from big uh, corporations or anything like that. We really rely on our readers to get by. And if you go to the top of the page right now, there's a great letter from John Mearsheimer, who is one of the most prominent foreign policy voices today, speaking out against the U.S. policy of what has happened in Ukraine. And I was just watching one of his lectures back from after the crisis in 2014, explaining how it was, the U.S. and the West's fault on YouTube, and that video had like 28 million views, which is a ton. So it just shows how important his voice is, and I'm really happy that he thinks we're worth people giving money to. So antiwar.com/donate. It's tax deductible. We're a nonprofit, so you can write it off. Go help us out. All right, the next article here, the Pentagon. This is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Pentagon pushes back on a Boeing plan to provide Ukraine with long-range bombs. So Boeing proposed developing kind of a new bomb for, I forget exactly what it was, for Ukraine that would have a range of about 100 miles. Using these munitions that they have, I think putting them on kind of a type of rocket that the U.S. has a lot of. They have a big surplus of it. But the Pentagon says that they don't think they need it. This is according to a report in Foreign Affairs. Pentagon officials are concerned that the weapons will be not really useful to Ukraine. They've previously been concerned that longer range weapons would risk Ukraine using them to hit Russian territory, and that could escalate the war. But Ukrainian attacks inside Russian territory seem to be a pretty regular thing now. But the U.S. has still held off on sending anything over the 50-mile range, which those HIMARS rocket systems, they're armed with missiles that can go over 50 miles. But this report says that the Pentagon is objecting to the transfer because it believes the munitions will be ineffective by the time they reach the battlefield. I think it would take 9 months. It is estimated that it would take for this to happen, for these bombs to be put together and sent to Ukraine. So it looks like this isn't going to happen. But who knows? Again, they could always change their mind, as they have throughout the war. And Ukraine is still saying that they are expecting to get these bombs. They want to get these bombs that Boeing proposed. All right. The next article here, this is really important. This is from ProPublica, and it is about the CIA-backed, what they call zero units in Afghanistan. Basically, CIA death squads that carried out deadly raids, and they killed a lot of civilians. And they have this report that looks into the civilian casualties of these Afghanistan zero units. And its reporter Lindsay Billing returned to Afghanistan in 2019 to research the murders of her mother and sister nearly 30 years earlier. Instead, in the country's remote reaches, she stumbled upon the CIA-backed zero units, who conducted night raids, quick, brutal operations designed to have resounding psychological impacts while ostensibly removing high-priority enemy targets. And they link to this really detailed report, like interactive. It's really incredible journalism here. If you want to go through that, very long and detailed, and eyewitness accounts and everything. But this is like a summary of it, it uh, and it's really incredible. At least 452 civilians were killed in 107 raids. And this number is almost certainly an undercount. While some raids did result in the capture or death of known militants, others killed bystanders or appeared to target people for no clear reason. A troubling number of raids appeared to have relied on faulty intelligence by the CIA. So really brutal stuff that the CIA was backing. So go check it out. Look around. We can't forget about the things that went down in Afghanistan. All right, the next article here, China, which we all know this, but China says that its increased military activity is a response to US and Taiwan collusion. So, a Chinese official said this week that the rising number of Chinese flights in areas around Taiwan is a direct response to collusion between the US and Taiwan, making clear Beijing's motives for its stepped up military activity. This is a point I'm always kind of trying to make because a lot of times the media, removes all the context of why we're seeing more Chinese planes around Taiwan, even though it's very clearly a response to the U.S. support for Taiwan. So this is Ma Zhaoguang. He is the spokesman for China's Taiwan Affairs Office. He said that recent drills conducted by the PLA, that's China's military, are a solemn warning, how he put it, against Taipei's increased provocations. And he said that the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the ruling party of President Tsai Ing-wen, recently intensified military collusion with the U.S. And there he's referencing the National Defense Authorization Act for 2023. That's the military spending bill that Biden signed into law. It includes unprecedented military aid, and it also includes provisions to increase military cooperation. We might start seeing like drills between the US and Taiwanese military that are more public than they've ever been. And in response, China held major drills around Taiwan right after Biden signed that. And so, again, it's obvious, but I think it's just important to point out. And here we have a Chinese official saying it, and things really escalated after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. The former House Speaker, she went there in August, despite warnings from China, and just left a mess. Really, I mean, just the level of Chinese military activity now around Taiwan since she went has really increased. And so she could go over there and get a photo shoot. Okay, the next article, Assad, the Syrian president, tells Russia that any deal with Turkey must result in a Turkish withdrawal from Syria. So Assad told this to a Russian envoy who visited Damascus on Thursday that basically any rapprochement with Syria must result in Turkish forces withdrawing from Syrian territory. So Russia's special envoy for Syria was in Damascus discussing Moscow's efforts to broker talks between Ankara and Damascus. His visit came a few weeks after Moscow hosted the Syrian and Turkish defense ministers. And that was the first meeting at that level between Syria and Turkey since 2011. It's a pretty big deal because Turkey, backed all these anti-government fighters on the ground in Syria, and they still do in the north. But they were all in on the regime change effort against Assad. So this is very significant what's happening here between them. And Assad said that in order for these trilateral talks to be fruitful, the meetings should be based on prior condition and planning between Syria and Russia. So he's saying Russia and Syria need to coordinate things, before Turkey's brought in. And then he said that the occupation and support for terrorism needs to be ended. And support for terrorism, he's talking about those anti-government fighters that Turkey backs. And Turkey also tacitly protects, I don't even know if I should say tacitly, basically protect Al-Qaeda in Idlib in the northwest of Syria there. They're basically under Turkey's protection, I think, the way the territory works. There's Turkish-backed fighters around there, and Syria doesn't go past a certain point. Anyway, and that's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. that controls most of Idlib, HTS. Turkey doesn't openly back them, but they have cooperated with them before. And of course, and HTS, the media has tried to give them a rebranding and say that they're not Al Qaeda, but that's where they came from. So there were rumors following the meeting in Moscow and in the recent meeting that Turkey agreed to withdraw from Syria, but sources told Middle East Eye that no deals were made. And since then, that meeting was towards the end of December. There's been no indication that Turkish troops are leaving Syria. But Turkey and Syria have both signaled that they're prepared for more talks, and Russia is trying to set up a meeting of the two countries' foreign ministers. So reports have said that the next meeting could happen in mid-January, but Russia's foreign ministry said Thursday that a date has not been set yet, but they're still working on it. They say it's going to happen. Erdogan, the Turkish president, he signaled this week that he expects more talks. He said that more Syrian refugees are going to be able to return to Syria if this engagement bears fruit. Of course, the U.S. is discouraging this. They don't want Turkey and Syria to normalize. And they've reiterated that they oppose countries normalizing with Assad. The U.S. maintains crippling sanctions on Syria with the purpose of preventing the country from rebuilding. Very brutal policy. And it's ultimately regime change, a policy of regime change. But Assad's not going anywhere. So instead of encouraging, getting out of the way, because the U.S. also occupies eastern Syria, instead of pulling out and just letting Syria form relations with its neighbors again, the U.S. is in the way, trying to keep the pressure on the country. And these sanctions, of course, as they always do, are just hurting ordinary Syrians. And a UN special rapporteur really detailed recently how civilians are paying the price of the sanctions. All right, the next one, the last story in the news section. This is another one from the Libertarian Institute from Kyle and Connor Freeman. Oxfam finds scores of civilians were killed by U.S. and UK weapons in Yemen. So a human rights monitoring group has released a new report finding at least 87 Yemeni civilians were killed with American or British weapons during a 14-month period. The Oxfam report reviewed 1,700 attacks on civilians and found Saudi Arabia used U.S. or British weapons in over a quarter of those incidents. So they reviewed incidents that took place between January 2021 and February 2022. The author of the report said that these attacks wouldn't be possible without, the supply of these arms. And the Americans and British weapons were used by the Saudi military to kill 87 civilians, bomb 19 medical facilities, and displace over 300 people. Over 1,700 attacks on civilians were recorded in that 14-month window. That's a lot of attacks on civilians. And this has been they're notorious for doing this Saudi-led coalition in Yemen that the U.S. is backing. And when it comes to airstrikes, because this was before the ceasefire, so this was while Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen. And they were really bombing it towards the end of 2021 into 2022. And that their Air Force is basically reliant on maintenance from the U.S. and logistics and intelligence, things like that. So that's another way. It's not just the weapons that the U.S. is providing them. That's everything for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Jonathan Cook, how the U.S. paved the way to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. One from Kit Clarenberg and Tom Secker over at the Gray Zone. Declassified intel files expose inconvenient truths of the Bosnian War. So that's really interesting. One from Doug Bandow over at the Cato Institute. Saudi Arabia is no ally of America. One from Chaz Freeman at Responsible Statecraft. Refashioning a new East Asian order. And our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone. Mainstream media journalists are cowardly, approval-seeking losers. And then one from a Guantanamo Bay survivor over at The Guardian, Mansour Adaifi, if I said that right. And then our picture story is about Gitmo. It's 21 years old, still open, still people in there being held on no charges. The notorious torture prison. That's it for me for today. That's it for me for the week. I'll be back after the weekend. But again, antiwar.com/donate to help us keep going, help us finish this fundraiser so you don't have to hear me keep talking about it. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, share it around, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts and places like that. That really helps too. But that's it for me for today. I'll talk to you after the weekend. Thank you.